Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah. I'd like to start my talk with a digression, but it's a digression which I hope will set the scene for the rest of the paper. One of the courses I teach in the UK is called Islam, State and Government. Now, this is a title which was imposed on me to a certain extent by the Teaching and Learning Committee of the university, which is an eminent group of largely political science and international relations experts, whose ability to choose the right name for the right course is as poor as their knowledge of what I actually teach. If it had been my choice, I would have called the module The Art of Muddling Through. What happened after the death of the Prophet when Muslims realized there was no overtly political ethos in the Quran, and how they spent the next 1400 years trying to fill the vacuum. But clearly that title would have been too long and my choice would not have gone down well with my colleagues. Politics, they believe, is what Islam is all about today. And thus it makes sense for our modules, our courses, to reflect this. After all, they asked me rhetorically, what I wanted to say was that while none of the groups which operate within the matrix of Islamic movements can claim to be identifiable primarily as religious movements, various individuals have appeared now and again with the avowed aim of fostering renewal of belief, sometimes dedicating their whole lives to that aim. And around some of these individuals, movements of considerable size and importance have formed. Sayyid Nursi is one such individual. In fact, he is the only modern Muslim scholar I can think of who has been able to reach such a large audience by focusing on self-reform and the renewal of belief alone, rather than by selling a particular political message. Sayyid Nursi's enigmatic utterance, "A'udhu billah min ash-shaytan wa siyasa," is seen by some as proof of his uncompromising distance from politics, with distance from politics being seen as one of the defining characteristics of the Nur movement. But Nursi was no stranger to political involvement. In fact, the way he himself divided his life into three ideational and developmental stages, the old Said, the new Said, and the third Said, was to a certain extent informed by the differing degrees at which he was engaged politically throughout his life. During the old Said period, which covered roughly the first 45 years of his life, Nursi's involvement in the political life of the waning Ottoman Empire was considerable, particularly during the period of the Young Turk Revolution. Nursi was caught up in the current of reformist thought which swept through the country. He openly professed his support for freedom and constitutionalism, both of which he deemed to be in line with Islamic principles, and he made a case for both of these ideals in his numerous speeches and newspaper articles. At the end of the First World War, Nursi continued to be politically active, supporting in his writings the national independence effort in Anatolia and, significantly, opposing the Kurdish-Armenian agreement regarding the creation of an autonomous Kurdistan, a stance which says much about his approach given the fact that he himself was a Kurd. The birth of the Turkish Republic in the early 20s also saw the birth of the new Said and the emergence of a thinker whose primary objective is now to throw light on the truths of Islam by holding up a scholarly mirror to the Quran. At this point, Nursi withdraws from political life. In 1922, when he was invited to Ankara, he was horrified to see the extent to which secularism and aggressive westernization were informing the political agenda. Despite being courted by Mustafa Kemal, Nursi would have nothing to do with the new regime, responding to Ataturk's approaches by saying, "The new Said wants to work for the next world and cannot work with you, but he won't interfere with you either." And that's what he did. He worked for the next world, preferring the seclusion and the power of the pen over political involvement and the power of dangerous ideologies which he saw as a threat to the spiritual well-being of the Muslim community. Nursi would not step foot into the political arena again for 30 years, during which he dedicated his life to expounding the truths of the Quran and attempting to strengthen the religious feelings and the Muslim identity of the people. In fact, the only political involvement he had with politics in the next 30 years came as a result of the regime's insistence on interfering with him. Nursi lived much of his life under government surveillance, spending long periods under house arrest or in prison, always on fabricated charges which ended inevitably in acquittal. With the advent of the multi-party system in the late 40s, we see yet another transition as the new Saeed becomes the third Saeed. Now, while the basis of these transitions is overwhelmingly psycho-spiritual, it's impossible to overlook the fact that they also tend to coincide with periods of great change. With the defeat of the Republican People's Party in 1950 and the rise of the Democrats, Nursi's self-imposed exile from politics came to an end. Discerning a certain amount of positive feeling towards Islam on the part of the Democrats, Nursi then starts to champion the party's cause, describing the party's leader Adnan Menderes as a hero of Islam, and in 1957 encouraging his followers to vote for the party in the national elections. Now, this brief overview of the three phases of Nursi's life, characterized as they are by the very different approaches on his part to politics, comes with a very important note. It's important to bear in mind that political engagement in Said Nursi's understanding of the term differs from political engagement as we understand it today. Firstly, his political engagement was dynamic and completely in accordance with the context and the dictates of what he perceived to be the Quranic ideal. Secondly, Nursi was never interested in status or position. He had no aspirations of carving out for himself any kind of political career. Nursi's engagement with politics was informed by his compassionate desire to save the politicians from themselves, and the overriding imperative he felt to protect the truths and the ideals of Islam from the dangers that were caused to them by the politicians. Nursi's support for the Democrats, for instance, was limited to giving advice and urging them to take measures which would strengthen the faith of the people. In fact, he referred to the Democrats as the lesser of two evils, and this signifies the importance which he placed on the preservation of Islamic ideals rather than the promotion of a political party. For him, those ideals are threefold. He writes, "The three supreme matters in the worlds of humanity and Islam are belief, the Sharia, and life. Since the truths of belief are the greatest of these, the Risale-i Nur's select and loyal students avoid politics with abhorrence, so that they should not be made the tool to other currents and subject to other forces, and so that those diamond-like Quranic truths are not reduced to fragments of glass in the view of those who sell or exploit religion for the sake of the world, and so that they can carry out to the letter the duty of saving belief, which is the greatest duty." Part of Nursi's appeal lies in his uncompromising belief that it is belief, Iman, which must be renewed and protected, and that all other endeavors must be approached with the primacy of belief, self-awareness, and God-consciousness in mind. The fact that, unlike many of the popular Muslim thinkers of his time, he renounced the art of politics, particularly when politics is supported by religion, earned him the respect and conferred on him a sense of authenticity that arguably so many other Muslim leaders lacked and still lack. Another part of his appeal lay in his shrewd interpretation of the forces ranged against him. For Nursi, unlike many of the Muslim thinkers who came later, realized that if there is a conflict between Islam and modernity, it is not a conflict fought over issues of government or technology or science or democracy. For Nursi, the conflict is ultimately about transcendence. With the post-Enlightenment experiment claiming a centrality in the universe's affairs for humanity, that Islam, with its emphasis on the dependence of humankind on God, cannot countenance. For Nursi, human beings are faced with a choice: belief in the sovereignty of God or belief in the sovereignty of man. For Nursi, salvation consists solely in choosing the other over the self, and it is in the dynamics of this choice that the key to an understanding of Nursi's approach to spirituality and reform and man's place in the cosmos may be found. So, renewal and reform do play a part in Nursi's worldview, but unlike so many of his peers, it is the renewal and belief and the reform of the individual which constitute his primary concern. In this respect, he is one of few Muslim thinkers in the 20th century who has little to say about the socio-economic or the political externalia of Muslim life. Over the past 30 years, we've heard time and time again this utterance: Islam is a complete way of life. It is a mantra repeated by the vast majority of Muslim movements. Consequently, emphasis has largely been placed on the implementation of Islam at the socio-political level, with debates focusing mainly on issues such as Islamic law, Islamic education, and the concept of the Islamic State. As such, most Muslim movements can be said to adopt an externalist approach to religion, seeing in the strict adherence of Muslims to the Sharia, and sometimes the imposition of the Sharia, the key to the formation of an ideal Muslim society. For these people, reform has come to mean chiefly the reform of society, the underlying aspiration of which must be to return to the golden age of Islam, which is typified for them by the community state of Medina during the lifetime of the Prophet. I usually tell my students that these people are dreaming of Medina. In fact, these dreams of Medina and the concomitant desire to share or to impose these dreams on others are responsible in part for the Western perception of Islam as a political ideology rather than a divinely revealed religion. The relative merits and demerits of Islamism or political Islam as terms by which to describe this politicized approach to Islam needn't occupy us here. Let's just say that in the last analysis, this approach rests on the notion that the return of Islamic rule, the transformation of the Muslim world into an ummah analogous to the community state of Medina, and, wittingly or unwittingly, the reduction of the Islamic revelation to the single issue of governance. For not only is Nursi distinguished by his opposition to any kind of uprising or any kind of revolution in the name of Islam, but he also stands out on account of his aversion to politics in general and the politicization of Islam in particular. And of course, as Professor Kaya mentioned before, one must mention that in Nursi's eyes, the jihad we need today is not the jihad of the sword, but the jihad of the pen. And more importantly, the inner jihad against the nafs, the sacrifice of the individual I for the collective we, a sacrifice which is necessitated by the conditions obtaining in the modern world, which is the age of the ego. Nursi believed that the present age demands from each individual a form of struggle with the soul known as Jihad al-Akbar, the greater jihad. For he asserted it is only through the creation of a collective Islamic personality which grows out of such a jihad that the forces of misguidance and unbelief can be challenged. Physical jihad, in other words military jihad, might have been justified in the past, but as far as today is concerned, Nursi says it is the metaphorical sword of true civilization, material progress, truth and justice which will defeat and scatter the enemies of Islam. The so-called civilization of the non-Muslim world can be conquered not through force, he says, but through peaceful persuasion. To this end, all that Muslims have to do is to demonstrate the elevated nature of Islam with the tongue of mute eloquence, lisan hal, namely by adhering to the precepts of Islam in their own lives and thus acting as ambassadors of Islam in the presence of others. as he says, our way is concerned only with morality and religion. Its path is to be molded by the moral qualities of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and to revive his practices. Its guide is the illustrious Sharia. Its sword is decisive logical proofs, and its aim is to uphold the word of God. Our way, he says, is to wage the greater jihad, jihad akbar, with one's soul, and to guide others. 99% of its aspiration is directed not to politics, but to licit aims that are the opposite of politics, such as the nurturing of fine morals and right conduct. In actual fact, what Bediüz Zaman advocates is highly political, but not in the usual sense of the word. If politics is the art of control, Islamism or political Islamism is the art of controlling others. The politics of Nursian jihad is not about controlling others, it is about controlling oneself. So Nursi's message here reflects the message of Mecca at the time of the Prophet. For the Meccan message is that man must first target and strive to overcome the demands of his concupiscent soul, his nafs al-ammara. He must learn to impose order on his own self. If politics is the art of ordering society, then Quranic politics is the art of ordering the self. The community of believers in Mecca and later in Medina grew organically out of the self-ordering of individuals and their entrance into a collective of souls upon which had been imposed the politics of self-restraint. So, to finish, the emphasis in the Muslim world today, where Islam has been reduced to governance, is the imposing of order on the lives of others. In that sense, while it claims to be Medinan, it is actually difficult to describe it as being so. Politicized Islam is pseudo-Medinan, if anything at all. Nursi's way is Meccan rather than Medinan. And because of this, it is slower, more laborious, and infinitely more difficult. It is the way of evolution rather than revolution, which may not please the tabloid editors of the Western press, who are always on the lookout for stories involving Muslims who are bent on destroying Western civilization. However, it's an accurate reflection of the Quranic message which Nursi in the Risale-i-Nur endeavors to communicate to us in this age. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.